This video is a part 2 looking at Gintama's historical context, so as such I'm just gonna get straight into it as to not repeat myself. I'd highly advise you to watch part 1 if you haven't already to get you up to speed, but with that being said, let's begin. But first and foremost, I want to address a mistake in part 1 in which I said, so much so that he's considered one of the 3 great nobles responsible for founding the modern nation of Japan. The other 2 have no connection to Gintama. Well, this was pretty poorly researched, my apologies, because as with Kido Takayoshi serving as the basis for Katsura, Saigo Takamori serves as the basis for Gintama's Saigo. Born in 1828, died in 1877, just 4 months after Katsura, Saigo was a fellow revolutionary who helped in the pursuit of the Meiji Restoration to reinstall Japanese imperialism over the increasingly unpopular Tokugawa shogunate. As we know, the Meiji Restoration was a success, and thus the Japanese Empire came to be, with Saigo as a national hero highly regarded within Japanese society, again much like Katsura, although as the years went by, his relations with the new imperial government began to sour. Over the next decade, Saigo became increasingly unsatisfied with new laws and policies imposed by the imperial government, especially with their treatment of the samurai class of Japanese society as they began to fall into non-existence, a concept that is, of course, heavily brought up in Gintama from start to finish. But nonetheless, this anger would eventually erupt into all-out violence, when Saigo spearheaded the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, which was a devastating defeat when Saigo was shot and killed in combat, leaving his legacy all that remained. But all in all, as you might have guessed, there's not a huge amount of similarities between Saigo Takamori and Gintama's Saigo, apart from them both being samurai notable for their physical stature. Like in Gintama, Takamori was notoriously massive, standing in at over 6 foot, but keep in mind the average height for a Japanese man around this time was only about 5'2". So with that misconception from part 1 out the way, let's get on to some other notable historical influences, starting with one of the most interesting and recognisable settings in all of Gintama, and its equivalent, the infamous red light district of Yoshiwara. Yoshiwara was a government-sponsored red light district set up by the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo in 1618, alongside equivalent districts in Osaka and Kyoto, in order to limit and restrict large-scale prostitution, common in early Edo period Japan. It goes without saying, Yoshiwara obviously left a dark mark, especially by today's standards. Most of Yoshiwara's approximately 8,000 to 9,000 prostitutes came from extreme poverty, often sold into the district as young children, spending most of their lives as courtesans. Although not universal, the conditions for women in Yoshiwara were appalling to say the least. Women would be quite literally behind bars or in cages for the wealthy merchants and samurai of Edo to feast their eyes upon, with most of these women never seeing a chance of freedom unless they got exceptionally lucky with a customer or they simply escaped. Alongside being a district socially detached from the rest of Edo, it was also physically detached. Much like Gintama's Yoshiwara being both figuratively and literally blocked off from the rest of society, the real Yoshiwara was constantly guarded by a large moat, encircling the district, effectively making it an inescapable island. As mentioned, life in Yoshiwara was poor, with many women dying of syphilis and other STIs, as the district finally came towards an end by the early 20th century, as it gradually began to fade away until in 1958, prostitution became illegal in Japan by law, and Yoshiwara finally ceased to exist. But anyway now, since we're on the topic of Yoshiwara, let's continue with one of my personal favourite characters in Gintama, Tsukio, who much like Gintoki, is one of the few characters not to base their existence off a definitive historical figure, instead having their roots in mythology. Specifically, the Shinto god of the moon, Tsukuyomi, a prominent figure in Japanese folklore, alongside his siblings, the god of storms, Susanoo, and the goddess of the sun, Amaterasu. Although, unlike those two, he definitely got the short end of the stick. Not a whole lot is known about Tsukuyomi. The main links I can make are that Tsukuyomi is often considered an embodiment of order and beauty, two attributes that closely link with Tsukio and her leadership over the Hyaka, and the fact that Tsukuyomi is a man yet Tsukio is a woman could be symbolic of Tsukio's rejection of her womanhood growing up in Yoshiwara, although this is just speculation. And you could also link the fact that Tsukuyomi was the god of the moon, which contrasts nicely with Hinawa being described as the son of Yoshiwara, but with that being said, when it comes to mythology and folklore there's only a limited amount to dissect, so let's move on. Next up I want to take a look at the final character of the Joai 4 we've yet to discuss, none other than Sakamoto Tatsuma and his equivalent, Sakamoto Ryoma. Born in 1836, died in 1867, much like the likes of Katsura and Takasugi, Sakamoto was another key factor in the Meiji Restoration to displace the Tokugawa shogunate. Again, much like the other two, Sakamoto came from a samurai background and began to develop some heavy nationalist ideas from an early age, to plot against the shogunate in order to restore imperial governance to Japan. Much like in Gintama, Sakamoto was a skilled swordsman who later on in life would go on to become a merchant and tradesman, eventually founding his own small-scale trading and shipping company, of course being Kaientai, acting as a tiny anti-shogunate navy. Also, interestingly enough, much like Gintama Sakamoto, Sakamoto Ryoma is notable for allegedly favouring to wield guns, specifically pistols, instead of traditional swords, although the legitimacy of this claim is limited, so take it with a grain of salt. Sakamoto would eventually be assassinated under mysterious circumstances in 1867 by an unknown pro-shogun samurai, who is believed to have possibly been part of the Shinsengumi. In fact, this is what led to the execution of Shinsengumi commander Kondo Isami as the prime suspect in Sakamoto's murder, despite this most likely not being the case, as we'll get onto later. But anyway, some final links. There was also a member of Kaientai called Mutsu, although apart from being the namesake for Gintama's Mutsu, they don't share much in common, and both Sakamotos were born and lived in the province of Tosa here in southern Kyushu, notable for having a distinct dialect of Japanese, occasionally alluded to in Gintama itself. Furthermore, Sakamoto would often spend time at the Teradaya Inn in Kyoto, a prominent hotspot for pro-imperial loyalists, most famous for the Teradaya Incident, specifically in 1866, when men ordered by their local lord attempted to assassinate Sakamoto, but luckily he and his wife were able to successfully escape. And this is significant because the landlady of the Teradaya Inn went by the name of Otose. Although incredibly little is known about her, her reputation for supplying a place for anti-shogunate rebels facing persecution is of course a clear link to the relation between Otose and Gintoki in Gintama. But anyway, moving on now to another prominent faction within Gintama, the Oniwabanshu, a group under the direct control of the Bakufu, tasked predominantly as spies and undercover agents, established by Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune at an unknown time in the early 18th century. Their duties consisted of gathering intelligence and reporting directly to the shogun, as well as inspecting and surveying the countryside while undercover, with this element of espionage leading to the modern dramatized idea of them being ninjas, when in reality their duties were much less exciting. And furthermore, our main two members of Gintama's Oniwabanshu, Zenzo and Sachan, both have names derived from significantly older historical figures. Zenzo is based on Hattori Hanzo, a skilled samurai from the mid-16th century, notable for his service to the Tokugawa clan. Much like Zenzo's service to Tokugawa Shigeshige in Gintama, Hanzo served under Tokugawa Ieyasu, paving the way for him to become the first shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty, officially marking the beginning of the Edo period. Which is interesting considering that Gintama's Zenzo comes right at the end of the Tokugawa dynasty. But with that being said, on the other hand, Saratobi Ayame is much less clear, as her name is derived from Saratobi Sasuke, another prominent part of Japanese folklore, alongside the likes of Kintaro for Gintoki, so of course there's no definitive interpretation. Sasuke was a legendary figure of unknown origin, famously known for his agility and acrobatic ability, which allowed him to maneuver at lightning speeds, not too dissimilar to Sachan in Gintama, while, interestingly enough, also serving as the basis for the modern ninja archetype you often see in fiction, becoming popular in the 1920s and still standing strong to this day. But apart from that, that's about it for the Oniwabanshu, so instead let's move on once more to another faction in Gintama, the Yagyu Clan, where, like the Shinsengumi, pretty much all of their named members in Gintama have a historical namesake. The Yagyu Clan were a prestigious family of feudal lords from Nara in West Japan, most well known for the Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, a famous swordsmanship or kenjutsu school inherited from the famous samurai Kamizumi Nobutsuna after his encounter with the clan's founder Yagyu Munetoshi in circa 1568. With Munetoshi himself acting as the inspiration and namesake behind Yagyu Binbokusai, with their direct family tree remaining relatively intact in Gintama. Munetoshi's son, Yagyu Munenori, being the inspiration for Yagyu Koshinori, or Kyubei's dad, while most significantly, Kyubei herself is based on Yagyu Munenori's son, arguably the most famous member of the Yagyu family, Yagyu Jubei. Born in 1607, died in 1650, Jubei was a master swordsman highly regarded as the most skilled member of the entire clan under the direct service of the Tokugawa shogunate. From an early age, he, as well as his entire clan, were closely linked with the shogun, with him even acting as the personal sword instructor of Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. However, after this, Jubei's life becomes a little hazy. Incredibly little is known about his life in his 20s and early 30s, upon abandoning Edo in 1631, spending 12 whole years in the countryside to hone and perfect his skills, returning in 1643 until his eventual death in 1650, under again unknown circumstances, with suggestions ranging from a simple heart attack to an assassination. But nonetheless, one thing to note is that Jubei is firstly an incredibly popular character in modern media, inspiring countless characters from anime and manga, but one key attribute all of these renditions have, including Gintama, is a signature eye patch over one eye. As the legend goes, Jubei lost his eye in a sparring accident with his father during his childhood, prompting the modern image of him wearing an eye patch, although details around this are unclear to say the least. Some suggest this was simply just a myth, but that's not as cool. And finally, the remaining 4 named members of the Yagyu family don't have any historical connection. Instead, each of their names are parodies of characters from the manga and anime Ichigo 100%, because why not? And with that, we move on once again onto yet another prominent faction in Gintama. We've covered the Shinsengumi, now it's time for the Mimawarigumi, a secret police force who worked in a similar fashion to the Shinsengumi to maintain public order in Kyoto. Not specifically Edo like in Gintama. Both groups would actively hunt down and eliminate those in opposition to the Bakufu and Tokugawa shogunate, with both forces occupying separate parts of the city. The Mimawarigumi were the elite guards of important buildings, such as the Imperial Palace itself, while the Shinsengumi were tasked with guarding the more common commercial and residential districts of the city. Our familiar faces from Gintama, Sasaki and Nobume were also based on their respective real-life equivalents, who fulfilled the same roles within the organisation as they do in the show, with Sasaki Tadasaburo acting as the Mimawarigumi commander from its beginnings in 1864 until its dissolution in 1868. Like many members of the Shinsengumi and Mimawarigumi, Sasaki was killed during the Boshin War, specifically right at the beginning during the first battle of the war, the Battle of Toba Fushimi, which resulted in a devastating loss for pro-shogunate forces. However, what makes Sasaki so significant is what I alluded to earlier, the fact that he was allegedly the mastermind behind Kondo's execution, A few years after the completion of the Meiji Restoration, former Mimawarigumi member Imai Nobuo, of course being the namesake of Nobume, confessed in 1870 to have been the one responsible for the assassination of Sakamoto, under the orders of Sasaki, allowing Sasaki to falsely arrest and execute Kondo by cleverly framing him as the true murderer. A similar synopsis to what we see in Farewell Shinsengumi, albeit in a different context. And after doing all this research, I gotta say it is pretty interesting how Sakamoto was unarguably one of the most significant individuals during the entirety of the Bakumatsu period, yet he still gets no screen time and is relatively insignificant in the core plot of Gintama. I mean, I don't think Sakamoto and Nobume even appeared in the same scene, let alone fought each other. But regardless, other than his confession of murder, nothing more is particularly important or known about Imai Nobuo, apart from the fact that he was likewise an incredibly skilled swordsman, and was, interestingly enough, one of the few pro-shogunate figures to live well into the 20th century, dying in 1919, later than anyone else I've covered so far. But with that being said, I think it's about time to wrap it up. Again, if there's any mistakes in this video, my apologies. I'm no historian, just a passionate fan of Gintama. If you have any suggestions for future content, be sure to leave me a comment, and I'll be back in the next video. See ya!